Hey, everybody, welcome back as we probably finish the book of Ruth today, at least the text. I think this will be our last session together in the book of Ruth, and then we'll be on a little bit of a break for part of the summer. We'll be coming back, and so we just want to say thanks as you join us for your participation. Let me just read the conclusion here. We're in verse 13. Remember yesterday, Boaz made his intention clear to marry Ruth, and the people wished him a blessing. And so now we get kind of the aftermath or the rest of the story. Starting in verse 13 of chapter 4, then Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Abinadab, Aminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. And there ends the book of Ruth. An interesting conversation about some of these verses from a biblical scholar perspective, listening in on those discussions, not to suggest that we are in them. As to whether this is original to the text, for a long time, Bible scholars thought that this was added later. However, a more recent round of scholarship has given rise to a pretty strong contention that these are original to the story. And that would, of course, mean that the story is being written looking back, which seems defensible, seems likely. And if that's the case, then we have this wonderful story. And again, highlights interesting. Ruth is done speaking in this text. We haven't heard much from her in the end of the story. We end kind of as we started, with a focus on Naomi. And as we saw Naomi in the beginning of the story lose her future in many ways, now we see that she, not only she, but Israel has gained a future. And very fascinating, the last word in this book is David. The reminder that Boaz and Ruth stand as the great-grandparents of David. Maybe 3 greats. And you can do the math on that. They're great, and they're grandparents. And so this very interesting personal story now becomes a national story, now has a bridge to being the story, the part of a story of a people, and particularly from a Christian perspective, with the idea that the Messiah would come from the line of David, it becomes an even bigger story than I think we could imagine as we end it here. This story connects to our own story as we find it in Jesus Christ. And I think, that makes the story of Ruth very compelling on lots of different fronts, Michael.
Yeah, there's so many details, there's so many layers. When we go through a book like this together, Clint, I think one of the things that inevitably happens is we often sound like we're repeating ourselves because we see things that come up consistently. And as you point that out, you begin to see these patterns over and over again. And I think the complexity of the characters and the complexity of the storytelling in the book of Ruth is a element that stays true throughout the entire story. And I want to just point out another example of that we have in this text here is verse 15 here. He, in this case speaking, the child shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. And this idea that is going to sort of come out in the text like this is that while the child represents this possible inheritance and connection, it's not just the child who's a he, because just previous to that, of course, Boaz is the one who marries Ruth. Together, they conceive of this child. But then the author also says in verse 13, it's the Lord who makes Ruth conceive. So who is the one who's doing the redeeming here? I think there's this beautiful complexity built into the book of Ruth. Boaz is a part of the story. Certainly, Ruth and Naomi have an exceptional kind of role in this Old Testament story. So their agency is clearly a substantial part of this coming to pass. There's this child. But here, a story that hasn't had a lot to say about God, though we've pointed out some of those possible hints and sort of under the text kind of moments. Here, we literally have it explicitly said in verse 13, it's the Lord active in the conception of this child. Here, I think we're seeing some of this complexity lived out, Clint. There's a lot of nuance in, well, who's the one who's going to be the restorer? Who's the one who's going to bring completion to this? There's a lot of answers to that. There's a lot of different agencies and forces and nuance and complexity. It's all come together. And I think that's just part of what makes this story so compelling and so beautiful, is it allows all of that to live together at the same time.
I could be wrong, but I think this is the only thing in the story that we've been told that God does explicitly.
Yeah,
God
right.
has been referenced and certainly in the background. But here, this is direct action. Now, on one hand, all conception and birth. In the Old Testament, that's always God's domain, and that's an important theme in the Old Testament. On the other hand, it is this action. God now acts upon Ruth, and she bears a son. And then what I think is also interesting, Michael, as we close out this story, we hear the voices of women again. The women of the community bless Naomi. Again, Ruth is not mentioned here. This is Naomi's story, at least at the end. And it is, as it started, a female story. The one who was vulnerable, who suffered loss, has now been restored. He shall be a restorer to you. There is a future now for Naomi, for Ruth, for Boaz. It has been intertwined throughout the telling of the story. And now, again, to re-emphasize that point, not only are their stories intertwined, but their story becomes intertwined with the very story of Israel, because in their lineage, out of this pairing, out of this arrangement, will one day be birthed the great king of Israel, David, perhaps the eminent ruler in Israel's memory. And so a fascinating way that these streams flow together as we move toward the end of the story here.
There's some really interesting textual overlaps that might have struck you in our reading of it. And another I just want to point out here, of course, Ruth is the one who bears this child. But then notice in verse 16, immediately upon introducing that, we have the idea that it's Naomi who's the one who becomes his nurse, becomes the one who cares for him and provides for him. I think there's a kind of blurring between these two women here, even in the story, that this child who's born to a formerly Moabite woman is now directly connected to Naomi, directly connected to this inheritance, not just of land, but of family, of heritage, of passing on the tradition. And that is when it transitions out of just the story of a few people and some very notable humans trying to make their way through life. At this moment, the story transitions to that very cosmic national story that you're talking about, Clint. It becomes a touch point for, though through very strange means that no one would have chosen from the outset, Naomi then bonded through these kind of commitments and covenants and loyalty with Ruth. they come back to Israel, and then through this connection with Boaz and through all of this connection with the witnesses of the elders at the town, all of this layer upon layer has built such that the fruit of this relationship, directly conceived by God, the text makes clear. It is from that then we come to this list of descendants, the people who are going to be the furtherers of the nation. And of course, David being one of the most prominent figures in Israel's history, the connection to Boaz, Ruth, Naomi, and the story that surrounds that, I think it has a way of showing us what God's providence and care looks like in human lives. It's not theology of the systematic variety where it's all ideas. This is theology lived out. And when you see it lived out, you can see how one generation to the next is handed down, such that the legacy of faith becomes literally alive through the people of faith, even navigating some of life's hardest and most difficult circumstances. In that way, for me, Clint, at least this reading of it, has been a very comforting reading. That life's circumstances may not be good, but humans living it out as faithfully as they can is all that God asks. And God is faithful amidst the journey that we're on.
Yeah, I think there's a fascinating way to read that into this story in two ways, Michael. And the first is at a personal level. You know, this is Naomi's story. This is Ruth's story. This is Boaz's story. And the idea that at the end, Naomi holds her grandson with the promise of not only her future, but his future and even Israel's future. And having just, had the opportunity to host our grandson for a few days, that bond of that hopefulness of the future generation. There's something deeply profound about this idea of this woman who had lost so much and struggled so much, now gathering this child Obed into her arms as she now experiences a hopefulness and a redemption of sorts. The other interesting way is to pull out now, if that's the small way to read the story, to pull out and from a larger perspective say, what does this story say to Israel? And again, Bible scholars argue over such things, but many of them suggest that this was a story that gained prominence during the exile, maybe even in the aftermath of the exile. Now, there could be two things that matter in that. The first is maybe on the negative side. Ezra and Nehemiah in the rebuilding process are sending foreign wives home. They're saying, we're only to be the Israelites. There are no foreigners welcome. You have to rid Israel of your foreign wives that had been brought back from the exile. And this may be a way of pushing back on that, saying, wait a minute, remember Ruth? Ruth was an outsider. Ruth was an exile. Ruth was from Moab. She was an immigrant of sorts, an alien, certainly. And it may have been a way to say, hey, maybe we should be careful with that. But then from the other perspective, think about Naomi's story. What is Naomi? Naomi is a person who left Israel because things were difficult. She left with her family. She was forced to leave Bethlehem. While outside of Israel, experienced tragedy and hardship and asked if she had any future at all. Returned to Bethlehem and was restored and blessed again. Now, that is an exile story. Imagine those Israelites who have been carted off to Babylon, to Assyria, who have lost their homes, who are asking the question, is there any hope? Who like Naomi say, you should call me bitter, because that's been my life experience in these moments. And a promise to them through the book of Ruth that that's not the final word, that there is redemption, that there is restoration possible. And the reason a story like this could have been deeply, deeply important is because it rang those bells at a time when the people of Israel most desperately needed to hear them.
The impact, Clint, on real human lives cannot be missed in a story like Ruth. And I think that we sometimes make the mistake of thinking about nations as some sort of external thing that exists far outside of us, that have nothing to do with our lives or the choices that we make or the faith that we have. But a story like Ruth, I think, pushes against that. It says that sometimes simple faithfulness, simply navigating today and making your way forward with the challenges that you have, it can lead to impacts that you can't possibly imagine. Surely Naomi and Ruth didn't think about their story in cosmic national terms as they were living it. And yet the reality is the simple, not easy, I don't mean that to say that it was simply executed, but the idea of living life day by day, making the best with loss and grief and struggle, finding ways to exert agency when it wasn't just given to them. And as they did that and lived that out, people like Boaz came into their life, who was faithful and had good character. And then that blossomed into real relationship, which blossomed into marriage, which blossomed into a kind of hope for a future that God providentially turns to the benefit of an entire nation. That is the kind of thing that in the hands of God, small becomes great. And I think that of course there's a part of that could apply to us, sort of a comfort in the midst of our own life. I think maybe some of that also might provide context for our life, a reminder that whether or not you succeed today, whether or not you feel like you're contributing something great, it's actually God who's at work in all of these circumstances. And so for you, be comforted that all that's asked of you is today. All that's asked of you is faithfulness, not to know the future, not to know how the story is going to be told. That's not ours to write. Ours is simply to be faithful. And when we see these women, and then Boaz, who entered into that story late, when we see the way that they live that out, it's a beautiful ending. It's a hopeful ending. And that is, I think, one of the telling ways in which a story that didn't include a lot of explicit references to God was written in such a way that God's work throughout it can be seen. That's maybe the genius of this as a story, is how it can tell all of these stories at the same time and has something to teach us about how we should live our lives in light of it.
Yeah, I mean, those are things we often diagnose or recognize, I think, in hindsight, Michael. The story of Ruth and Naomi is just a story with Boaz. You know, it certainly doesn't turn into what it is until David, until people looked back on David and then said, well, where did David come from? And then it's, oh, yeah, well, actually, that's a fascinating story, too. And so the idea of the will and the work of God unfolding throughout the generations is certainly, I think, well attested in Ruth. And that's one of the things that give this book such power, I think, is that it really does a wonderful job of focusing on the personal and dialing out into the larger idea that God is at work, even in the small hardships and in the individual stories of our own lives. And so I think this author does a nice job of balancing that. You think you're reading a story about a couple women and then a guy, and it turns out there's far more to it than that. You're reading a story about Israel and King David, and ultimately about the God of Israel, who has been there, if not in the forefront, certainly working to bring good things ultimately for his people, even when his people are Moabites, which is a fascinating twist.
Yeah, and that goes with significant impact as you attend to the scripture that will follow. Friends, want to just say thank you so much for joining us for the study. I want to encourage you, if you've been with us, whether you followed with us live or now you've gone through this series of Ruth with us later, we would love for you, go down to the comments and say, I did it. I did the whole study with you guys. Let us know that you finished this. Both let us celebrate that with you, and also just want to recognize all of you who have invested the time to go on a journey like this with us. We're going to be taking a short break here as we move towards next fall. So if you have a book that you'd like to study, feel free to leave that in the comments as well. We'll certainly attend to that as we're making plans for the fall. But for the next couple of months here, we're coming into our summer, so we're going to have just a short period here where we're going to take off. And then once fall comes back here, late August, we will let you all know, and we're going to begin with another book. So thanks for being with us.
And just by the way, if you're not already subscribed, the easiest way for you to be notified when we come back together is a subscription, because you'll get the update as those new videos are released. So if that's important to you, if you want to make sure you're up to date, it would be helpful on your end to subscribe. Obviously, it helps us, but more importantly, it gets you notified and gives you notice when we start back in.
Well said. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
See you soon.